Harbor City Council Ordinance Committee of December 14th. Ms. Peterson, will you please call the roll?
Chair Bendy White.
Here.
Member House.
Here.
Member Hotchkiss.
Here.
And would you kindly read the item for consideration today?
The item before you today is the hedge ordinance suspension, and Renee Brook, the zoning and enforcement supervisor, will be presenting.
Thank you.
Hello, thank you. Good afternoon, members of the Ordinance Committee. We are here before you today to discuss some options for the potential temporary suspension of certain regulations regarding hedges. And just a bit of background, in the summer of 2008, both staff and City Council heard from many neighbors. At that time, there were quite a few hedge complaints regarding hedges and enforcement cases regarding hedges going through zoning enforcement. And at that time, Council brought to a meeting a discussion to consider temporarily suspending the hedge regulations for a period of 2 years, and that occurred on November 25th, 2008. Council expressed interest in amending the ordinance altogether, and staff has expressed that interest in the past as well for many years, but we've not had the time to conduct the necessary outreach in order to do that and have a comprehensive public community input and ordinance amendment. That was the intent with the last adoption of the suspension ordinance 2 years ago, is for us to have that outreach and community dialogue, and we've not been able to do that. Since then, the temporary suspension ordinance has expired. It expired November 25th, 2010. So we're here before you today to seek your direction and how we should apply these hedge regulations in the future, if we should consider another temporary suspension or not. And just to refresh you on the subject of the temporary suspension, it had to do with Municipal Code Section 2887-170. That relates to fences, screens, walls, and hedges, and the temporary suspension ordinance just applied to hedges. We've all along always continued to apply the requirements for fences and walls and screens. And at that time, the sections of the hedge ordinance that were suspended were just those that didn't have anything to do with or affect traffic safety. And so the two sections that were specifically suspended for 2 years were Section A and B1. And A is a section that generally limits the hedges of heights and fences and walls within setback areas to a height of 8 feet. The second section that was suspended was a more specific section having to do with those hedges within 10 feet of a front lot line where they're required to be no higher than 3.5 feet. A section that was not affected by the suspension is the section B2, which requires that next to a driveway, hedges be limited to 3.5 feet, and that was left in due to the potential for safety issues pulling out of driveways. Similarly, subsection C was not affected by the suspension, and that is the section that limits hedges and fences and walls near street corners to a height limit of 3.5 feet, again for visibility. And then the remaining sections of that municipal code section were not affected by the suspension. They have to do with more technical issues. So some quick diagrams to show you what that means. The codified regulations, meaning what's in the municipal code today, would require that these hedges in the bright green and yellow area be no higher than 3.5 feet. Again, this is just showing you what I described. Within 10 feet of the front lot line, 10 feet of either side of a driveway for a distance of 20 feet back. And then again here along the front lot line, the street corner around to this driveway. Areas in the darker green color, the code would require that they be limited to 8 feet in height. So during the temporary suspension...
So people better understand this. Really, we're talking about sight lines for drivers and pedestrians, correct?
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
The temporary suspension left intact those sections of the ordinance, like I mentioned, that have to do with hedges next to driveways and street corners. So these areas in the brighter yellow color, we're still enforcing and applying those sections of the ordinance. that they be limited to 3.5 feet. So during the suspension, all of these areas in the darker green were not subject to a height limit. So now that the temporary suspension has expired, we are seeking your direction for the future application of this section of the municipal code. We've outlined 3 options in the staff report. Our recommendation is up here for you to see, and that is to primarily keep the same language in the suspension ordinance, but this time make it clear that it just applied to enforcement activity only. And the reason that we're recommending that is it's our belief the last time this issue was brought before the council, the impetus for the suspension was really having to do with complaints and enforcement activity, and we didn't hear an outcry from the community having to deal with people having to reduce their hedges as a result of a condition of approval or application for a building permit. We have, the way that the ordinance was written, it did suspend those rules for those people applying for building permits, and so we have not made them reduce hedges as part of issuance of a building permit. We would like to, in the future, require that those seeking approval of new development on the property comply with all sections of the municipal code, including all these sections of the hedge ordinance, and that if we move forward with another temporary suspension, that we make it clear it's just for enforcement activity. The other options outlined in the staff report, the first bullet here would be to do exactly the same as we did for the last 2 years and suspend just those same 2 sections of the ordinance related to hedges only for enforcement and development applications. And a third option is to essentially do nothing in response to the expiration of the temporary ordinance and apply all standards of Municipal Code Section 2887-170 for enforcement and new development. So that would essentially go back to how business as usual as it was 2 years ago. So if we get to this portion of the meeting today, I have some proposed ordinance language here that reflects staff's recommendation, and we can get into that if we need to. In summary, again, staff is recommending that we suspend enforcement of just those sections of the hedge ordinance not related to traffic safety or pedestrian safety. It would only relate to hedges. We would continue to apply all the rules for fences and walls, and it would be for enforcement activity only. Anyone seeking development of their property, seeking a building permit, would have to apply with all the standards of the code. And we'd recommend that the temporary suspension this time be in effect for 3 years. We want to make sure that we hopefully could have the time and the resources to take on the public process to reach out to the community and come to you in a timely manner for a proposed amendment if that's the way that the community dialogue goes, and we're hopeful that we can do that within 3 years. So that concludes my presentation. I'm available for any questions.
Thank you, Ms. Brooke. By the way, folks that want to speak, please hand in a speaker slip, and then we'll deal with that. Mr. Hotchkiss, do you have a question?
I do, Ms. Brooke. Thank you. Excuse me. What do we mean by new development?
Councilmember White and Hotchkiss. By that I mean essentially anybody that's applying for a building permit. When we review plans that come in through the Building and Safety Division, we do zoning plan check, make sure it complies with all aspects of the zoning ordinance. So any activity that requires a building permit.
So it basically changes your footprint by 100 square feet or whatever it is. I don't know what the minimum is. Do you remember what the minimum is? Paul, do you remember what the minimum? Okay.
What I mean?
Any building permit, though.
Correct.
So, okay.
Correct.
All right, thank you.
House, do you have anything before we have public comment?
Very brief.
Okay.
Yes, for staff. In the last iteration, we excluded bamboo hedges from the suspension, and I didn't see it referenced up there. But if we wanted to just drop that exclusion, does anything have to change in terms of the language that you have here as a recommendation? Or would the recommendation need to specifically exclude bamboo if we wanted to exclude it? Or, I mean, how would that work?
Thank you, Councilmember House, for bringing up that point. I meant to mention that came up at the public hearing 2 years ago when Council considered adoption of the temporary suspension ordinance. And the language up here reflects an excerpt of the previous suspension ordinance here, where I have enforcement here in the yellow is a new addition we're proposing. But this is the section that if the ordinance committee did not want to accept bamboo from the temporary suspension, we could just
change that last phrase. Okay.
Just delete this last phrase here.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I have a question of council, and that is, with the suspension of the last couple of years, and folks have let their hedges grow up from, let's say, the 8-foot height, gone up to 10 feet. Has that now created a legal nonconformity for those that have now grown up in this suspension period?
Mr. Chair and members of the committee, no. The ordinance itself has a clear method for establishing a legal nonconforming hedge, and having your hedge grow during this last 2-year period doesn't satisfy that provision. And the standard, the suspension was simply a suspension of the enforcement of the standard. The standard has still been there and has been on, property owners have been on notice that it could be brought back at any time. And so I don't think that it has risen to a level of that there is an existing non-conforming status.
Thank you. All right, I'd like to start the public comment. And again, if you want to speak, please hand in a slip. James Webb to be followed by Mel Gemberling, and I have 2 minutes on each of the for each of the speakers.
Hi. Thanks for letting me speak today. I just wanted to remind council that the intent of the original intent of the hedge ordinance was public safety in the front yard setback. And I think if we focus on the species of plant, it takes away from the focus of what we're trying to do with the hedge ordinance. And I think what we need to do is, what should be done is to focus on not the species of plant, but the function of the plant, as opposed to in relation to public safety.
Okay.
Are you a pro bamboo speaker? Is that what we got here?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. I want to be sure of that.
I'd like to keep it would be good to keep a sort of a uniform approach to this and a fair study of the hedge ordinance as we go forward.
Right. Great.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mel Gamberling to be followed by L. Gamberling.
Oh, thank you. I'd just like to, as you go through this hearing today, I'd just like you to maybe reflect on a reference I have to Webster's New World Dictionary, Second College Edition, 1980. And the first word is privacy. The quality or condition of being private, withdrawn from public view or company, seclusion. In other words, I would like you guys to think about the height of hedges, situations where perhaps a building addition is made next to you, and that addition suddenly, where you didn't have anything before, suddenly looks into your yard and takes away all your privacy. And the homeowner's little piece of paradise there suddenly becomes not such a paradise. I wish you would take that in consideration, and that people who maybe plant hedges that are over 8 feet to cure this situation, so they will get their privacy back. You know, their value of their home drops, everything. I wish you'd consider that, and that it's very important to an individual in this town, someplace, somewhere. There's got to be people who are going through that. So I wish you would please consider that, like maybe a variance or something like that, that would allow things like something like that to happen. Thank you.
Thank you very much. L. Gemberling to be followed by Jim Westby. Okay, thank you. Jim Westby then, to be followed by Kellen DeForest.
Good afternoon, Ordinance Committee. My name is Jim Westby, and I just want you to know I support the extension of the suspension of the hedge ordinance, and this thing about development, I'm not going to submit a building permit, but it just seems to me that if I was, and I was going to revise my kitchen, I don't know what that's got to do with hedges. It seems like they would be unfairly treated if they submitted an application for a building permit. So I think you ought to take that into consideration. And I agree with the 3 years. It needs to be enough time so that we can finally vet this ordinance and then get it changed so we can, we know what we're going to do as a city. I'd also like to make a statement here about the 50 feet from the corner. When we're talking about mixed-use buildings, and I know those are mainly downtown, but we build right up to the lot line, no setbacks, and we go 45 feet in the air, and they're on corners. So I'm just trying to understand the safety issue here. I'm definitely for safety. I don't want you to misinterpret me, but I'm not sure we've got the right balance here on what we're doing to the neighborhoods for what we're doing downtown, and there's more traffic downtown than there is in neighborhoods. So I share that with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Westby. Kellen DeForest to be followed by Bill Mahan.
Good afternoon, Ordinance Committee. The problem has been for many years, certainly even long before 1957. The problem with the 1957 ordinance was it was a one-size-fits-all ordinance, and many properties in Santa Barbara are on hillsides where to screen or provide privacy, one needs a few more feet. But my main question is, how are the provisions of the code enforced? From the staff report the problem is they have nobody to enforce these. So I would like to ask, if you could ask the staff, how they enforce even the safety, the ones that are for the public safety provisions of the ordinance. How are those enforced, and who does the actual enforcement? Do the owners have to come to the police station, so to speak, or a office, or does somebody come out and say, cut this hedge, or we'll fine you X amount of dollars, which is
15 seconds, Kellen.
Not very much. So I would appreciate that information. Thank you.
Thank you. Bill Mahan to be followed by Michael Dean.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. Seems like most people agree that what's been happening with the moratorium is a good idea. I had a client, we put a one-bedroom addition on their house on the Upper East Side. They had a big, beautiful fence, a hedge. I don't know how old it was, whether it was pre-1956 or not, but to get their final, they had to cut that hedge down to 42 inches, and now it's all grown back up again. So it seems to me that in the staff report here, where they talk about 400 active cases, and 27 of them have to do with hedges, but only 5 of them have to do with hedges that are not health, safety, and welfare problems. That's not a very, very big problem in our city. We maybe have 20 or 25,000 single-family residences. It doesn't seem to me like this is such a big problem. I drove all around the Upper East Side this morning. Lots of big hedges. Maybe some of them pre-1956. I don't believe that when they did this ordinance, the original ordinance, that they ever made a record of the hedges that were non-conforming. That's a question that I have to ask, because if they didn't, nobody knows who's got non-conforming hedges and who doesn't have non-conforming hedges. And so that means that, to me, that there's a basic unfairness there when you force somebody that maybe had a hedge that was pre-1956, or maybe it was just a little bit later, and it is illegal. So I would support extending the ordinance 5470 for another 3 years, and recognizing that this is really not a serious problem. But one more thing, that on single-family design board, we very, very seldom had issues with hedges. So that's just something I want you to know.
Okay. I have a question of you, and that is, with your experience as an ABR and SFDB and Planning Commission member, we experienced the concerns about private views and how hedges can adversely affect that.
Yes.
Could you speak about that? Just tell me what your thoughts are on that as you struggle with it.
Yeah, I can. And generally speaking, at least in single-family design, my experience with single-family design board, we didn't have much trouble with hedges in the hillside design districts, because the slope is so steep that the hedges are far enough down that they don't ever be a problem. It's in between the flat areas and the 20% slope where you start to have a problem with hedges. In the flat zone, like in Upper East Side, nobody cares. They don't have a view anyway, so hedges are just privacy. But between say 10% slope and 20% slope, there are some problems. But we didn't look at too many things in that particular zone, because we looked mostly at the hillside design district.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, Michael Dean, our last speaker.
Good afternoon, committee members. My name is Michael Dean. I've been a city resident and property owner since 1972. I live in the Upper East. And I read the staff report last night. And from the presentation today, I believe I'm in favor of what's being proposed by your staff to extend the suspension for 3 years. I'm certainly in favor of ensuring that there's good sight lines at traffic corners, et cetera. But I'm very much opposed to a 3.5-foot limit in front of my house and many, many of the other houses that I know in the Upper East. It really would be a detriment to our privacy and a lot to the street sounds, et cetera, particularly for those of us in older houses that are probably non-conforming in terms of the degree of setback from the street. So I'd appreciate your concurring with your staff's recommendations.
Great, thank you. Do we have one last speaker coming in here? Okay. Mr. Corrigan, please come on up. Patrick Corrigan.
My name is Patrick Corrigan, and I live at 836 Jimeno Road. And I just wanted to say this, that I'm very much in favor of the hedge ordinance. It was a lifesaver for me and my wife 2 years ago when we went to court and had it upheld. And I think we're here today because of the actions of one neighbor who filed all these complaints against people in the neighborhood and elsewhere. This was just totally done out of spite, and it resulted in all this time and energy being put forth. Unfortunately, I feel responsible indirectly for what she did, and I apologize for that. So I'm very much in favor of your reinstating the hedge ordinance, and I think it's a good tool. I think it's necessary, and I think it'll, when it's done legitimately and complaints are filed legitimately, it has a lot of valid. So thanks very much.
Thanks, Mr. Corrigan.
Could you explain? Yeah, would you explain? You said it was sort of life-saving. What happened? What's going on here?
Well, we tried to get our neighbor to take down her hedge, to cut it down so it wouldn't block our views. And she said, no, I'm just going to let this hedge go as high as it can go so I don't see your house. And so we had to hire a lawyer, and we prevailed. We went to court and spent a lot of money, but we did prevail. And they had to cut the hedge to 8 feet. And so now we have everything what we had when we bought the property. Thanks.
Okay. Anybody else want to speak? Please hand in a slip if you have there, sir. Yeah.
Sorry, my first time here, gentlemen.
Hi. Well, please
Nick
hand in a
Barton.
slip when you finish, okay?
Pardon me?
Hi. Please hand in a slip when you're done.
Okay.
And please state your name for the record.
Okay, Nick Bartlini. I'm a resident of the Upper East, twice around now, moved back. In the Upper East, which is rather unique compared to many of the other areas of Santa Barbara, most of the places, by way of example, between Constance and Mission, there are only 5 places that do not have walls or high hedges. I happen to own a place there now. I previously had a place at 1926 Santa Barbara Street, which had high hedges. That's the conformity of the neighborhood. The place I have is grandfathered. Both hedges, both neighbors violate everything. But they've been there. They're not a problem. It's a happy association. Everybody's pleased as such. I think this little guide the city's put out on being a good neighbor is excellent. I use it religiously. The point is that I have gone in. I have satisfied my neighbors. I put in hedges to the best, making common sense in terms of aligning with the others, setback, right height, the rest of it. But does it meet the letter of the law today? No. I will admit that. But I think under law, intent governs. The neighbors have been very complimentary. The Pearl Chase Society have knocked on the door and asked if they could show the house in May. It was kind of a scruffy place previously. I won't give you the address, okay? So it's an enhancement. And on a test of logic, are we better off now than we were before with my specific property? I think the neighbors would agree, completely. In fact, they paid compliments. That's the first point.
15 seconds.
Pardon me?
15 seconds.
Okay. The second thing, I just wonder about this enforcement activity only. Is this on a complaint basis? In other words, I do not have a problem unless the neighbors complain, which they haven't.
Okay. We'll address those questions. Yeah. Thank you. Okay. Okay. Mr. Grockenberger. Okay. We're going to get this. All the speakers out there one way or the other.
My name is David Grockenberg. I'm an attorney practicing in Santa Barbara. I listened to the comments. I have a question for you when you consider the ordinance and recommendations of City Council. When you reference here, staff reference, the recommendation for enforcement activity only, let me just say that I deal in the private sector, and there are circumstances that arise where a nuisance can occur when hedges go beyond 3.5 feet, even 8 feet. and those are important. So what I would like to see is that there's a clarification. When it's suspended for enforcement purposes, that may be the city's position. But there are certain rights between property owners that may need to be looked at in a different context. Example, its relationship, the hedge height ordinance to the view ordinance. So when the recommendation is enforcement activity only, if that relates to city enforcement but leaves on the books, essentially we have a ordinance, we have heights, and essentially what you're saying is those are in effect, we're just not going to enforce them. I'd like to see a clarification that the private enforcement rights, such as they might exist, are not impacted by your decision to suspend. That would be my comment.
Thank you. We'll ask about that. Thank you. Okay. Well, then the matter is now back to the committee. Mr. Hotchkiss? Mr. House?
Well, let me just ask that last one of our attorney. It's my understanding that that when we have included this suspension, it hasn't held back private parties if they wanted to hold one another to the letter of the city's ordinance requirement. Did I misunderstand that?
Mr. Chair, members of the committee, that the suspension ordinance that was adopted 2 years ago and has since lapsed only spoke to this particular section of the zoning ordinance, 2887-170. The view dispute ordinance that Mr. Grochenberger just referenced, and I think also his client, I believe, Mr. Corrigan, that was never actually affected by the suspension ordinance. However, the two do interrelate, as you heard Mr. Corrigan explain. In addition, there are state statutes that deal with vegetation that can be built up as a spite fence. And vegetation, if it's situated in a particular manner in order to impact to the degree that it's a nuisance, a neighboring property, and if you can show the requisite intent on the property owner's part to basically annoy their neighbor, you can actually prove up a case of a spite fence under state law. So there are, and our ordinances, both our hedge height ordinance as well as its suspension ordinance, cannot affect that state statute. So that does act independently. At the same time, a clarification is easily done in a future suspension ordinance, and if the committee wishes to recommend that to the City Council, we can make that clarification easily.
Oh, very good. Thank you. Then just when we get to that point, I'll be suggesting that. And literally in the interest of brevity here, I think that the staff recommendations, number one, is one that I do support, with the exception of the last phrase in the section 1 of the ordinance where it says, except with respect to hedges consisting of bamboo plant. I'd like to see that stricken from the suspension. But that's where I am on it today.
Great. Thank you, Mr. House. I wanted to follow up on Mr. House's question to Mr. Vincent, and that is, when you said clarification, are you saying, Mr. Vincent, that basically, let's refer to Mr. Grochenberger's comments, we're saying that the private enforcement of the ordinance, is that suspended as well in this? The way I'm interpreting our proposal today, and also what's been on the books, is that private enforcement of the 8-foot limit has also been suspended. Could you comment on that?
Well, Mr. Chair, I wouldn't say that there isn't so much a private right to enforce the city's zoning ordinance. However, how a hedge is maintained by a property owner could be brought as a private nuisance by one property versus another property owner. That would be brought under state statutes.
And that has nothing to do with height. It's just is it a nuisance?
The height would factor in significantly into whether or not a hedge becomes a nuisance. I know that it would make Mr. Grochenberger's life easier if there was a clarification in any suspension ordinance for our zoning standard that it does not affect the view dispute ordinance, which is a separate ordinance. However, it is easily and frequently confused by members of the public, and that confusion is sometimes seized upon by both the property owners who are maintaining the hedges and their attorneys in order to confuse our local judiciary as to whether or not a a case can be brought under the view dispute ordinance, which is a separate ordinance. So the clarification will make it more clear not only for property owners, but also if a dispute arises under the view dispute ordinance, it will help both the attorneys and the judiciary in applying our view dispute ordinance.
Okay, thank you. And I'd like to follow up with a question of Mr. Grockenberger, if I may. Was the litigation that occurred that involved Mr. Corrigan's property, was that under the view dispute ordinance, or was that under the 8-foot height limit ordinance?
It had
was
three
it both?
causes of action. It brought the view ordinance into play. It brought the hedge height ordinance into play. It brought the spite fence ordinance into play, which is the reference to state law.
Right.
And to answer your question, because you have three different activities going on. Under the spite fence ordinance, the one limitation on that, which is why I raised the question about not eliminating, if an individual says that they are privately impacted by the exceeding an 8-foot, for example, that they would still have the right to point to this ordinance because it's on your books. It's not revoked. It's there. You're just not enforcing it. So really, I was looking for a clarification that allowed, if it doesn't limit nor enhance in any way the private parties, but they have reference to it. In answer to your question, the court found that there was the 8 feet was being exceeded, and the intention was to exceed it by 14 to 18 feet. I mean, it was an egregious situation at that time. So the court found that it was going to limit it and was going to limit it to the 8 feet. All right. Now, the view ordinance gave an entitlement, actually, in that court's finding to bring it down to ground level, but we weren't interested in that, and we were looking at accommodating privacy as well as view issues. So I think the clarification is important, meaning that this doesn't impact a view ordinance, but I was drawing a little more fine line. I was looking to, if the city just doesn't have the time, which I understand, or the resources now, but it's on the books, so that essentially the public would say at its peril is allowing things to grow and exceed. The city's not going to do anything with that, but I wouldn't want that to limit the private, and that's why there's a slight difference. Answer your question and more.
You did. Thank you.
Thank you. All right.
Well, may I ask our attorney real quickly, because that was my understanding, just exactly how the gentleman just said it, Mr. Vincent. Is that your understanding as well, that if you were to craft a little bit of clarification, that it would effectively, it leaves the existing ordinance on the books, of course, unaltered one way or another, and it would leave that as a standard that could be referred to by private parties? We in the city are not enforcing that because of the suspension, but it doesn't then tie their hands from referring to it in some action.
We could include that kind of clarification.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Hotchkiss?
All right. So just to beat a dead horse here, Mr. Vincent, somebody could have recourse if we pass this in either 1, 2, or whatever we do here. Somebody still could have recourse if there was a view problem or another problem in the private sector, as it were.
Mr. Chair, members of the committee, yes, the view dispute ordinance has never been affected by this suspension.
Okay.
So that exists, and the state law, the rights conferred by the state statute have existed, and I believe as Mr. Grockenberger mentioned, that being able to point to a local standard for the height of a fence is a useful tool in establishing whether or not a spite fence is existing.
Right.
And so if we can clarify that if the council wishes to keep the standard but to suspend enforcement, I don't see any issue with having that suspension ordinance clarify that the standard is still there for those other private purposes.
I just want people watching to understand that if we do pass this, which I hope we do, there still is a recourse in situations, albeit expensive. Sorry about that. And I agree with, in part with Mr. Howes. I think it would be good to take this reference to bamboo out rather than discriminate against it. It's a pretty good cover when people want that. I do have an exception, and I'm wondering if, Grant, I could get you to reconsider. I do think that remodeling your bathroom or whatever should not subject you to losing your privacy. And I think Benny knows, and I know as a realtor, that privacy can add tremendous value to a home, $100,000, maybe more, and that to have to lose that just because you want to update your bathroom or kitchen or whatever is not a good idea.
Mr. House, yeah.
I share your concern. Perhaps staff can assist us with the threshold issue here. There's development and there's development. There's these kinds of renovations and the kinds of small improvements that happen to homes, and then there's some that are over 500 feet or some whatever a threshold might be that doesn't kick in a whole, all these other kinds of cascading consequences. So, what's the current threshold, and what might there be that would address the concern that both of us share?
Mr. Chair, members of the committee, currently we don't have a specific threshold of a size of a development. It really is more closely related to the extent of overall changes on the property, where if we need an entire site plan identifying all topography, hedges, fences, walls, because the nature of the development involves those, then we ask for that information to be on the plans. If it's something very simple, changing out some type of mechanical equipment in the house, we're not going to get an entire site plan. We aren't going to necessarily enforce or require that they trim their hedge as part of that. So I don't have a specific threshold to offer, but if there's some comfort in knowing that we use our judgment based on the nature of what's taking place on the property, do know that it doesn't always come up in every case.
Well, I wish we could actually find a line, even if it's a little fuzzy. It'd be really helpful to this, because I think the scale of it, and I think the way you just described it, would be something I'd feel very comfortable supporting if we could accomplish that. So that's something I would really like to have some help on before it comes back to council anyway.
Can I make a suggestion? It's nice what you said, but I know if I'm a homeowner and I read it's up to the judgment of the inspector, I'm going to like, oh my God, I hope they have a good day today. So better than that, we might resort to some of the minimums that we did with the fire extinguisher ordinance, although not as bad, and that was a percentage of redevelopment of the house. So if you're really doing a major thing, then okay, that's the trigger. And in that case, it was 75%, but we could make it, say, 50% or something here. Mr. White, I'd appreciate hearing what you have to think.
Well, first of all, I'm probably not going to be able to support where my colleagues are going on this, but I would suggest some square footage number or percentage number would be options. I mean, 100 or 500 square feet. I see Mr. Brook is teed up here, so hopefully not teed off.
No. Mr. Chair, one suggestion we could offer is if we have this apply to just discretionary projects, whereby those that require review before the staff hearing officer or design review board or planning commission, that we could have the regulations of the hedge ordinance apply to those, whereas if it's just ministerial, all you need is a building permit, we could continue to suspend the application of these sections to those permits. That would be a very clear distinction.
I like that. I think that would be...
Well, can you put that in plain terms?
Sure. We could continue to suspend the application of these sections of the hedge ordinance to those developments that only require a building permit. They don't require going to the single-family design board or any of the other design review boards. So
that'd be remodeling, that sort of stuff.
Correct, as long as it doesn't have to go to the single-family design board or staff hearing officer for modification, or a larger development that would need to go to the planning commission.
Okay. Well, I don't think it's perfect, but I could live with that.
Okay. So I'd like to weigh in before we get a motion here, and that is, first of all, to sort of respond and reflect back what we've heard from the good folks that have spoken today. Hedges are clearly a key asset to this community. We are blessed with a climate and a geography, and also a legacy of hedges being integral to the quality of our life. And we see it. We see the Upper East is it's mentioned, but really in every neighborhood we can look around and see how everybody has planted pittosporum, boxwood hedges. I mean, they're just things of beauty and things that make our homes excellent. There are also the runaway pittosporum. That then goes from being a beautiful pet to being a loser of value. And this is where, and I know Mr. Hotchkiss can appreciate this as well, where that $100,000 in value that was created by privacy gets destroyed by somebody imposing it an overgrown hedge. And as we've seen Mr. Corrigan and Grokenberger speak to, a loss of a view. So as a planning commissioner, I was always of the mind and struggling with Mr. Vincent and his predecessor with saying, I want to protect private views as much as the law allows. So that is definitely a place that's just a policy base for me that says I want to do that. At the same time, I want to encourage these privacy hedges and places where there's no harm, no foul. I want it. And so this probably comes with the rehashing of the ordinance to try and make it a softer process to encourage large hedges where privacy is an asset and not harmful, and encourage, if not require, the maintenance of views where people, I mean, just that is, as we all know, if you have an ocean view, I don't care whether it's from your bathroom on the second floor, it adds to the value of the house, and it adds to the quality. I mean, people treasure that. So that's kind of where I'm coming from on this. I feel like the suspension is going to end up, we're going to have more privacy and fewer views, and that's going to be problematic for many homeowners going forward. So, we are all struggling with the idea of triaging staff work at this point. We're still not done with Plan Santa Barbara, where maybe development's going to start increasing here at some point, and we're going to need more staff. So we're struggling with budgets and staff time and all that, and I appreciate that that's a real problem before us. Mr. Mahan, this is truly exceptional, so please be.
Thank you. Just the issue of having the threshold be those projects that go before design review. You should understand that the single-family design board does not look at single-story houses except for in the Hillside Design District. So in a typical flat neighborhood outside of the Hillside District, you could have a two-story house that would do an addition, and they would have to cut their hedges down, and you'd have a single-story house right next door that could do an addition, and they wouldn't have to cut their hedges down. There is something wrong with that.
Okay. Well, that's yet something else wrong with this situation. I was thinking of a square footage number, either the 100 or 500. But we can look at that at council level as this thing goes forward. But as I say, I'm still struggling with just putting this on hold. I think that there's a better answer, and maybe it'll only come out of this 3-year period. But this is, I don't think suspension is the best answer, and I know that the existing ordinance we have could use a few tweaks as well. There was a point made about nonconformity. What was happening in '57? Everybody can relate to that, except for the houses that were built in '58. That we can go there. Anyway, those are my concerns, and I think that I ask that, I'll be asking the council as well, but my colleagues to look at the notion of, could it be, for example, a change of square footage, going to 100 feet or 500 square feet. Those are a couple that we've seen over the years as part of ordinances, which triggers the next level of examination. That's where I would be advocating going forward. So I'm ready for a motion.
Mr. Chair.
Mr. Vincent?
I know you have a busy day, and I'm just looking at the time. Quite honestly, this body is where I think that issue of either square footage or discretionary application or something else ought to be hashed out, because to take the council's time in a council agenda
Thank you.
would just be
Got it.
A lot of sausage making.
All right. So those are suggestions that don't make me happy, but I ask you to consider as a way to bring it down to the one-story buildings. Mr. House?
Well, let me ask staff on that, because I think the key to that is consistent implementation. So we have a very simple, recognizable standard. You mentioned a full landscape plan as part of a requirement. That would affect. That usually goes on a discretionary review, but then that wouldn't be the same threshold that Mr. Mahan has concerns about, because it would apply to whichever kind of project it might be, or again, it could be a square footage. But I think we're trying to find some consistent place where it makes sense to staff that we would begin to, drop the suspension and really, apply the ordinance straight out on new development. Can you help us with that right here, right now? Do you have any suggestions? I mean, I agree with Mr. Vincent that, leaving this for a debate at full council, we'd better do it here.
Could I make a suggestion?
No, I just a minute, please. I want to hear an answer first on this, because
Mr. Chair, members of the committee, it don't have a square footage threshold that I think would apply and necessarily have a great nexus to when we would ask for hedges to be trimmed or reduced, and the same with walls or fences. We tend to look more critically at those projects and plans that go through a discretionary review process. We do a full zoning plan check on them, so we have the information in front of us to make sure that there's compliance.
Does that include the hearing officer level?
Correct.
So
yes.
Actually, then, any project, single story or two-story, would be covered on that, right? In other words, some of them would go to the single-family design review board, some would just go to the hearing officer, but all projects that would be of interest in this context would be that move beyond just a building permit over the counter would hit one of those on their way to planning commission or wherever they go.
Mr. Chair and committee members, as Mr. Mahan mentioned, there are many additions that could occur in single-family homes that would not trigger review by the single-family design board. So in that sense, they would be ministerial and would only require a building permit.
Right, but that's maybe what we're talking about here. We're talking about that level that we would like to be included in the suspension. That would be what we're talking about. And then the ones that would be more extensive, that would require the review, that would be the dividing line. I mean, I think that, okay, so I'm going to put that in my motion, and we'll see how far it gets. But I think that gives us a criteria that would then apply consistently for projects that are larger than just requiring a ministerial building permit effectively over the counter. And it gets to the concerns that both of us share about that. And then maybe if it gets to council and staff has serious concerns about it, you might want to weigh in there. But I think it might give us what we want.
Yeah, put it in a motion. Let me make sure I understand. Thank you.
We'll do it then. Mr. Chair, I move that we effectively accept the recommendation of staff, number one, suspending enforcement of the standard on complaints, but enforce the standard on new development, and specifically establishing a criteria that it's for the suspension applies for projects that require only building permits to go forward, and that it wouldn't apply to those that require discretionary review, including the staff hearing officer level. That's that piece. Secondly, that it would take out in this except with respect to hedges consisting of the bamboo plant from the suspension ordinance, and and also with a caveat or actually explanatory language, as Mr. Vincent and we all talked about, having to do with that that the standard, that it clarifies that the standard remains in place even though the city is not actively enforcing, and that would then allow for the private sector to use that as their standard. So Mr. Vincent will work on that language for us. That's my motion.
Okay, question. So I just want to make sure I get the trigger right here. If it goes to the staff hearing officer, he or she has total discretion. If it requires a building permit, does the discretion also remain?
Mr. Chair, members of the committee, maybe I can clarify. You're correct in that if a project is required to go to the staff hearing officer, it's a discretionary action. She uses discretion in making her decision. That project also requires a building permit.
Okay.
But I think the distinction that's being proposed here is that if a project only requires a building permit, no discretionary action by a decision-making body, that this suspension would apply to that.
That's what's in the motion, yes.
So, all right, so if it went to the staff hearing officer, it may or may not apply, is that correct?
The regulations would apply in that.
Regulations would apply. So if I was putting a 500 square foot addition on my house, and it's a 2,000 square foot house, where would I stand on this probably?
It might depend. If it triggers review by the Single Family Design Board, it would be a discretionary project, and then all the hedge regulations would apply to that project.
Okay.
And if it's a one-story building, it would not apply.
Yeah.
So you can just grow those hedges up on your one-story building, and you can get your 1,500 square foot addition, and
well, that would
forward.
That would still go to the that still would go to the hearing SRO.
No,
right?
it would not. Would not.
No, just to clarify, it would not unless it required a modification or some other
Oh, I see.
permit
That's right.
that
That's
required
right.
staff hearing
One story.
officer review.
So it's.
Oh, and Mr. Chair, every remark you made, I completely concur with in this context. We must wrestle this ordinance to the ground at some point within these next 3 years, because it really needs to get rewritten so that it addresses these things, and a suspension really is not a permanent solution. It's just what we're dealing with using right now to put it off.
I appreciate that. So we still don't have a second for the motion. Are you not seconding that, Mr. Hodgson?
No, because I want to see a slightly less stringent requirement and I'd rather put it in square footage or percentage. And so my alternative would be a 40% change or addition to the size of your existing home, whether it's one story or 2 stories.
Well, since we're discussing it just like this, I don't agree with that, because I think that with a key into discretion is you really get to look at the context and the person who's doing that review, or the body that's doing that review, will look and see if it matters, if it's important, and how that would actually register on the Richter scale of impacts to the neighbors and all the rest. That becomes part of the approving, say, the landscaping plan, which would be required at some level. So I really think this cuts it at the right level, Mr. Hodgkiss. I share your concern, and if we can't come to agreement here today, perhaps we'll have to continue it and ask staff to help us with it and refine it better. But I think we should have a criteria, and I think that the discretionary review is a good place to cut the line, because it keeps it with the smaller projects where it would be onerous and unnecessary, but it allows the ordinance to be in effect for the projects that require the more extensive review. I like that line. Unless, again, staff can come up with something better, but that seems pretty, it would be helpful for staff to know where to cut it as well.
So, Mr. Hotchkiss, will that work for you, or do we need to have staff come up with some other options and then?
Yeah, I really think we do, not because what Mr. House said isn't clear, it is, but I personally, and I think maybe all of us, need to think through what the ramifications of these things are, and they're more usually than immediately meets the eye. So I would like to keep working on this.
All right. So what I'm hearing is that the request to staff would be to come up with some triggers, options in the way of triggers, for this committee to look at. And you've heard the discussion so far, and I expect you can divine some options going forward.
And I do agree with the bamboo that Mr. House.
Okay, well, that'll come back again. We're going to just suspend this suspension discussion at this point, and
I'd like to hear what Mr. Casey has to say at this point.
If I could just suggest, I think our staff's bias going forward with the options that we bring back to you will be to try to find an existing trigger, something that we already have an established process, because I'd hate to add another layer for staff to have to track and say, wait, what was the trigger? That's a completely different trigger. And so we'll bring back options of and that's why we kind of like discretionary review off the top of our head, but we'll look for other kind of standard triggers that we might be able to bring back.
Yeah, if I may say, just wanted that the public really understands this and it's not arbitrary. That's the key thing. Thank you.
Okay. So then, may I have a motion to continue this for further research into triggers?
So moved.
Second.
All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed? Okay, so this will be continued, and thank you all for your conscientious testimony and effort to show up and help work on this with us.